Reče svima, ja sam Srđan Radović, etnolog, antropolog, više naučni saradnik Etnografskog instituta SANU u Beogradu i moderirat ću večerašnji event, odnosno tribinu, koji je još jedan od nizu događaja koji organizuju Centar za jugoslovenske studije iz Beograda, Dom omladine Beograd, a večeras takođe u saradnji i sa našim kolegama i prijateljima iz Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju Univerziteta u Beogradu. Svi znamo da smo u jeku COVID sezone, tako da sama činjenica da imamo mogućnost da se uživo nađemo je fantastična i drago mi je da imamo priliku ovako uživo da razgovaramo o jednoj vrlo zanimljivoj temi koja ima veze i sa rodom i sa našim prvim susjedstvom, a na širi način i sa nekom našom zajedničkom evropskom istorijom, ajmo tako reći. Tako da je super što ćemo ovo večeras uživo da radimo, pošto je pitanje šta će se dešavati u oktobru. Da li ćemo se svi ponovo vratiti na online formate definitivno i šta i kako. No, zato smo tu večeras da razgovaramo sa našom gošćom. Ja mislim da je ona i prvi govornik na našoj seriji tribina koja nam dolazi iz stranih akademskih zajednica koje nisu post-jugoslovenske. Takođe će ovo biti prva tribina na kojoj će svi izlagači govoriti na engleskom, a posle ako bude pitanja iz publike i komentara, vidjet ćemo. Možemo i na engleskom, možemo i na našem jeziku, pa da prevodimo. To ćemo vidjeti još. A za početak, prvo bih predstavio ko će nam sve večeras govoriti. Our guest of honor, što bi rekli, odnosno naš glavni prezenter večeras, je naša koleginica, profesorka Džil Masino, koja je vanredna profesorka istorije na Univerzitetu Severne Karoline u Charlotteu, gdje drži kurseve iz savremene evropske i komparativne istorije. Njene istraživanja obuhvataju pitanja roda, građanstva i svakodnevnog života u socijalističkoj i postsocijalističkoj Rumuniji. Ona je objavila veliki broj članaka i knjiga, među njima, evo, ističemo tematski zbornik pod naslovom, daću ga na engleskom, Gender Politics and Everyday Life in State Socialist Eastern and Central Europe iz 2009. godine, koji je uredila zajedno sa Shana Pan, right? Sa koleginicom Shana Pan i njezina knjiga Ambiguous Transitions, Gender, the State and Everyday Life in Socialist and Post-Socialist Romania iz 2019. godine, izdanje Berghahn Books. Njen trenutni projekt na kojem trenutno radi se ponovo bavi Rumunijom i istražuje odnose Rumunije sa više zemalja globalnog juga u toku hladnog rata. Nakon nje, koju i nama će koleginica Masino jednu vrlo specifičnu temu koja ima rumunski rodni kontekst predstaviti, što ću ja dati na kraju predstavljanja naših gošći, samo naslov, ona će da obrazloži i naslov i temu i onda će i dati svoje predavanje. Nakon toga će se na njenu prezentaciju nadovezati naša koleginica Anamarija Soresku-Marinković, koja je više naučna saradnica Balkanološkog instituta SANU. Ona je doktorirala na Univerzitetu Babeš Boljaj u Klužu u Rumuniji sa tezom iz antropologije folklora. Anamarija Soresku-Marinković bavi se sociolingvistikom, antropološkom lingvistikom, romanskom i balkanskom lingvistikom, studijima komunizma i postkomunizma i studijama migracija. Uredila je nekoliko zbornika o romanskim jezicima na Balkanu, autor je jedne monografije o vlasima istočne Srbije, druge o rumunofonim zajednicama izvan granica Rumunije, kao i zbirke intervjua, vrlo zanimljivo, preporučujem to za čitanje, znači i tematski i zbog formata, znači oralne istorije i takve vrste etnografske građe, znači zbirka intervjua sa Rumunima koji su tokom komunističkog režima u Rumuniji naučili srpski jezik redovnim gledanjem programa jugoslovenske televizije. Što mi malo stariji pamtimo, to nije bio samo slučaj u Rumuniji, Albanci su postali poliglotska nacija, na primjer, u toku režima Envera Hodže, tako što su gledali jugoslovenske TV stanice, a da ne govorimo o italijanskoj televiziji. Tako da imamo de facto bilingvalnu naciju tamo koja govori italijanski i albanski, zahvaljujući upravo onome o čemu je Anamarija pisala. Te na kraju će nam takođe govoriti i Adriana Zaharijević, koja je viša naučna saradnica Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju Univerziteta u Beogradu. Ona je diplomirala filozofiju na Filozofskom fakultetu u Beogradu, a sve kasnije nivoje studija završila je na Fakultetu političkih nauka, spajajući političku filozofiju, feminističku teoriju i društvenu istoriju 19. vijeka. Tekstovi su joj prevedeni na više evropskih jezika, autorka je monografija Postajanje ženom, koje je pojedinac, genealoško propitivanje ideje građanina i život tela, politička filozofija Judith Butler. Nakon što naše koleginice budu dale ova svoja međusobno povezana izlaganja, koje započinjemo sa profesorkom Masinom, takođe, ako bude pitanja i komentara, i tu je mikrofon, tu smo mi, tu su naše gošće, da sve prokomentarišemo što vas interesuje. Kao što sam rekao, na početku će nam se obratiti koleginica Masino, koja će nam sada otpočeti izlaganje, koje ću ja prvo naslov izlaganja ću dati na engleskom, potom pokušati da ga prevedem na naš jezik, znači Gendering Eigensinn, Women, Power and Everyday Life in Socialist Romania. Znači, orodnjavanje Eigensinn smo upravo ustanovili da bi na našem jeziku najbolji prevod tog termina bio svojeglavost. Znači, orodnjavanje svojeglavosti, ajmo možda reći, ja sam mislio da je isto dobar termin, možda prkos, i onda kaže žene, moć i svakodnevni život u socijalističkoj Rumuniji. Malo će više o samom Eigensinnu, odnosno svojeglavosti, nam na početku reći sama profesorka Masina. Jill, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I'm just taking your word for it that it was kind, because I only understood a few words, including my name and the title of the book and the presentation. And I'd like to thank you all for being here. I know it's a difficult time, and I appreciate you coming out. And of course, I'd like to thank the DOB Omladine Beograda for inviting me to give this talk, especially because I'm a specialist on Romania, not Yugoslavia, and so I guess that's not, your typical choice. So I really appreciate you giving me the floor. So I feel like it's a great privilege and honor to be here, and I'm excited to share a slice of my research with you. So this is the cover of my book that came out in 2019. And of course, because of COVID, I wasn't able to do any type of book tour. I only did one online, so it's great to be here in person and to discuss parts of it. And of course, I'm not going to give you an exhaustive overview of the book. I'm going to be looking at through the lens of Eigensinn, and in particular how women employed Eigensinn, mobilized it in a way to negotiate particular spaces and just make the best out of the situations in which they found themselves. In the time that I have, I will be giving, as I said, a brief overview of the book. I'll talk about Eigensinn, and we can define that. I'll come to more specific definitions, but we can define that as a kind of self-reliance or self-assertion, and something that was mobilized, as I said, by women to negotiate relationships, to challenge power structures and sexist practices, and in some cases to even reinscribe repression in the case of socialist Romania. And of course it applies to worldwide, you can use the term. And I'm going to be looking at how they employed Eigensinn in both the workplace and at home, and with respect to a number of actors, so partners, bosses, colleagues, and even state authorities. And what I want to stress is that Eigensinn wasn't always necessarily anti-state. In some cases, it could be anti-patriarchy. And that's how I came to this topic of gendering Eigensinn, because often scholars think of it in terms of challenging the state or finding this kind of space. But from doing this research and thinking about how women negotiated the situations in which they found themselves and tried to assert agency, I realized that there was a particularly gendered way in which they were mobilizing Eigensinn. And I think what's important here is that suggests, of course, number one, that women had agency, but also that potentially socialist discourse was quite powerful in helping them realize their place in society, realize that they did deserve to be treated a particular way as equals, and assert themselves in certain cases. In some cases, they even referenced that socialist ideology. And so, of course, part of my talk is going to be stressing that we cannot just kind of ignore or neglect the ideology of the state as, empty tokenist propaganda, that it had meaning for some individuals. And, of course, we can't know exactly what went through women's minds, but we can, I think, through the way in which they express their experiences, make sense of and conceptualize their actions. And, as I said, the way in which they mobilized Eigensinn enabled them to deal with challenging situations, often frustrating ones, and in some cases, heart-rending situations. So there's also this clear psychological dimension to Eigensinn, and in some cases, it was actually a coping mechanism, and I'll get to that. And, the final thing I want to note is that women's assertions of Eigensinn were assertions of power in a society that we often associate with powerless, right? So I'm looking obviously in the situation of a one-party state where the borders were closed, where there was censorship, and where there were no means of organizing outside of the state. But, my findings demonstrate that through the mobilization of Eigensinn, we see women's ability to assert agency and to challenge power and to be empowered in certain cases. And so not in every case study that I show today will it kind of be feminist in kind of meaning, and we can open that up in the discussion because, that's obviously open to interpretation. But another thing I want to demonstrate is that, in certain cases, the way in which they did mobilize Eigensinn was a form of feminist praxis. And of course, this is in a climate where there was no grassroots feminist movement. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the presentation now. So gender and Eigensinn. So as I said, Eigensinn can mean self-will, self-assertion, self-affirmation. It also can refer to self-preservation. And the term was coined by German historian Alf Ludtke, who recently passed, who was a practitioner of Alltagsgeschichte. And so I have that up there on the slide, everyday life history. And he was looking at the Alltag. And this is where we see these assertions of Eigensinn on an everyday level. But that's not to say that they don't have political significance. It's not to say that just because we're looking at the everyday, we can't understand structures of power, politics, culture, how the economy impacts on individuals' lives. Indeed, scholars of Alltagsgeschichte would argue that it offers another vehicle through which to understand power at multiple levels. And even though these power relations are often being negotiated, in the sphere of the workforce or the home, they're often mediated right through larger discourses. And as I said, sometimes they are in response to state authorities. They are actually in conversation or at least appealing to state authorities. And I've concluded this quote from Dorothy Wheeling's she's got a chapter in the history of everyday life, which was published in 1995. So that's an edited book by Alf Ludtke, where he includes various chapters on Eigensinn and how people dealt with it historically. And hers focuses specifically on gender, so I thought it obviously the most relevant to mine. And I'm just going to read this, and this is what she says. Eigensinn complements a scholarly perspective that is directed from the top down with an investigation of the grassroots as it interacted with different hierarchies. Crucially, it also adds a horizontal focus into the ways in which individuals at work or in other spheres interacted with each other. In short, the focus on Eigensinn relocates the scholarly perspective towards a history of everyday life, which does not ignore economic and political structures so much as investigate the complex ways in which these impacted upon individual actions and identities. And I kind of referenced that already, but I felt this quote was really, really encapsulated, how I view Eigensinn and especially the gendered component of it. Okay. So now I just want to move on to briefly discussing how I'm dealing with gender in the book, and then some of the sources I examine and some of the larger arguments I make. And then we will do, move on to the chapters, discussion of the chapters and how we see Eigensinn being mobilized in particular contexts. My book looks at gender as both a discursive construct and a lived experience. So, of course, this means, how it was constructed by the state, in policy, in the media, in film, right, in various manifestations from the top. But also how it was experienced by individual men and women. And I should stress that my analysis of gender also includes men necessarily. Of course, you have to include men. But what I mean, it also includes interviews with men. So I didn't just interview women. I also interviewed some men as well. And then I look at the ways in which gender intersected with various categories, right? So my study is a generational study, right? It looks at various generations. Some of the oldest individuals I interviewed were born in the late 30s and then up through the early 70s. So I wanted this multi-generational study so I could look at change over time, but also to see how these policies differently affected individuals, right, at different time periods, because certainly we're talking about, a country in which you have different leaderships, different political orientations. Location. So my interviews were primarily with individuals in Brașov, but I also did interviews in Bucharest. Even though, of course, these were urban women, you could say, when I interviewed them, many of them were raised in rural areas or semi-rural areas. So I look at how that rural experience affected how they interpreted their life in urban settings. And, maybe the way in which they actually try to rebel or resist that, maybe, the way in which urban opportunities allow them to escape. But I just want to emphasize that even though I didn't interview women in the countryside, peasants, that rural element is necessarily there, right? Because we're talking about a period of transformation that's gradual, and with the communist takeover in Romania in 1947, we're talking about a country that's overwhelmingly agrarian, right? And of course, you can all relate to that, and we're in Yugoslavia. Class is obviously important, and in a different way, as we know with socialist societies, right? So there are different types of classes. Social origins was really important. So once the communists took power, if you had any connections to the elite, right, the bourgeoisie, the old aristocracy, you could suffer persecution, certainly, if you were involved in politics, but even if you were a child of someone from one of those classes, you were put on a subordinate level with regard to access to education and other benefits. And of course, we know that there was never a classless society that emerged, right? We know that classes existed. There were blue-collar workers, white-collar workers. We had the nomenclatura, obviously the administrative elites. But of course, the interesting thing that does happen is you have situations where actually some blue-collar workers are privileged over white-collar workers, making more money, such as those in heavy industry. And so, that's an important factor that I keep into consideration in my book. I also look at social capital, so the types of connections and relationships that people develop that enabled them to improve their situation or offered them access to certain goods or services they might not have with that capital, right? And that capital, we're talking about something that isn't necessarily merit-based. They get they get those jobs or they get that house because they have these connections. So obviously that's important. Ethnicity. So I interviewed mainly Romanians, but I also interviewed Hungarians because there's a sizable Hungarian population in Brașov, and some Germans. There weren't many Germans left there, but a few Germans. I did not interview Roma because I didn't have an intermediary to work through to introduce me to Roma populations, but I do bring up the Roma in the book in various chapters, and certainly the women I interviewed mention Roma. So I want to kind of emphasize that they're not purposely excluded, but I'm getting at their voices through the voices of these other women. And then I look at how gender intersects with religion and cultural norms. And of course, sometimes religion, especially orthodoxy, overlaps with these cultural norms, right? We're talking about an overwhelmingly Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox society, and how these beliefs, attitudes, practices often work to kind of undermine state initiatives, right, because of their conservatism. But in some cases, the state also appropriates them, and that's pretty clear with the pro-natalist policies that are introduced by Nicolae Ceausescu in 1966. He very much kind of draws on these cultural norms, especially maternalist ones. Okay, my sources. So I use a number of official and everyday life sources, and I've just given you snapshots of some covers. So I draw heavily on the women's magazine Femea, Woman. I draw on the Communist Party daily Skantea, and I've selected an image that is, depicting the day of Stalin's death, right? It's from 1953, March of 1953. And then there's this still from a film called Postcards with Wildflowers. It's actually a film about an abortionist, and she's the one standing there. She's the evil abortionist who uses unhygienic methods, which lead to the death of the woman who you see in the bed, the young college student. And that came out in '75, and it was played in theaters for a little while. But so I use these types of media sources, newspapers, magazines, films produced during the socialist period, but also films produced during the post-socialist period. And then I use, obviously I draw on statistics, legislation. Here we have the cover of the 1972 Labor Code, where women start to be moved into more gendered jobs because of reproductive concerns, and that's a whole nother discussion we could get to. And social science research. So I draw on a lot of social science research about parenting, about childhood, adolescence, about marital relations, about sexuality. And this one is actually about sexuality. And it was published in 1972, and it's called Talking with Youth. And it was basically a primer on sexuality. And it was surprisingly revealing, explicit for Romania. There's diagrams, there's images, and there's detailed discussions of the physiological changes that adolescents experience, discussion of orgasm, et cetera, et cetera. And I saw this on a number of people's shelves, so this was a really interesting text to find. But that's just some of the example of the social science research that I used. And then, of course, the everyday life sources. And here I've just provided an excerpt from one of my oral histories. I'm not going to read it, but just to kind of give you a sense. And then these petitions or letters, some of them were letters of praise, some of them were letters of complaint, that individuals, ordinary individuals, wrote to the state. So they wrote to Elena Ceausescu, Nicolae Ceausescu, or maybe a local leader, but there's lots of them. And they're really interesting sources. And you could say they're kind of semi-official sources. They were collected by the state, but they were written by individuals. Okay, and so my arguments, obviously the title of my book is Ambiguous Transitions, and so I'm really interested in teasing out and illuminating these ambiguities, because that's what I found. And what do I mean by ambiguities? Ambiguities in terms of legislation, what's represented in the media, and also people's experiences. So the ambiguities are evident on multiple levels. Complexities, right? If there's ambiguities, there's complexities, and so I wanted to highlight those as well as the contradictions. One of the major themes running through the book is modernization, socialism as a modernist project, right? It's a project of modernization, which I see as both progressive and regressive, right? And we see that, obviously trying to get women into the labor force, initiating policies that protect women as laborers, that provide them with maternity leave, health care, education, et cetera, but also repressive policies. I mean, we see that with, obviously, the criminalization of abortion in 1966, the criminalization of homosexuality in 1968. So looking at how the dual face of modernization, and of course this is nothing unique to socialism, right? I mean, it happens in non-socialist societies as well, so I wouldn't claim that. Obviously, I'm looking at individuals as objects and agents, right? So objects of the state, of policy. So tools to help modernize the country, right? To women as tools to produce babies, if we're talking about Ceausescu's last 2 decades. But also agents, and of course, everyday life is in the title, so that's central, and that's going to be a central part of my talk here. Bringing agency back. Basically challenging the totalitarian paradigm, which has been challenged for decades, but I think sometimes still needs to be reinforced, and we need to have the sources to effectively do that. And so I try to triangulate these sources, the oral history sources, with the letters, with the state sources. Subjects or citizens? Well, if you follow the totalitarian paradigm, you'd say everyone was a subject. But I would argue there's citizens. There's socialist citizens. They're a part of a welfare dictatorship, right? Which is a term a lot of German scholars use. But we see this because people do have certain rights. They have social rights, they have economic rights. No, they don't have political rights for all intents and purposes. Yes, they can vote, but they're voting for the same person. But they do have these important rights that for some individuals were more important than political rights, right? Maternity leave, for instance, even though it was actually one of the shortest in the block, was still something. Vacation, right? 2 weeks vacation. Healthcare, you know, housing, subsidized food. So I see them as socialist citizens, and that's, citizenship is really central to my book. It's in the title as well, so that's why we have the state in my book. I look at continuities and ruptures. So I look at continuities between the pre- and pre-socialist period and the socialist period, but also to a lesser extent, because I only have one chapter devoted to the post-socialist period, between the socialist and post-socialist period. And so I'm really interested in these transitions, these two transitions. And then, of course, the relationship between socialist ideals and everyday realities, right? And again, the totalitarian paradigm would claim that there's a huge gulf between the two, but obviously I demonstrate that wasn't always the case, that there was some confluence often between the two, that there was, you know, there was realization of some of these ideals for some individuals, certainly not everyone. And I want to underscore that I'm not trying to dismiss the repression that existed. I acknowledge that, and if I could talk more in detail about my introduction, I would. I certainly acknowledge that we're talking about a one-party system that was characterized by repression throughout socialist rule, but particularly early, you know, 40s, 50s, and then again in the 80s. So I don't want to dismiss that and paint some rosy portrait, but I want to argue that these pictures need to exist, these portraits need to exist alongside one another. Otherwise, we don't have a full enough picture. And that's why, you know, I came to the conclusion of the ambiguities and the complexities. Okay, so I'm going to start with my case studies now, and I hope I have enough time here. You know, we'll see. Okay, so what I've done is for each slide, I've given you the title of that chapter and some images that kind of depict what's going on in that chapter. And then I have some quotes that are used, you know, to demonstrate how women were mobilizing Eigensinn during this time. So this is from my second chapter, which deals with childhood. And you might notice that every chapter is named after a song. So we can talk about that. I was just trying to have a little fun with it. And, you know, this is the abnormality of growing up socialist. Ab, I put in parentheses because a lot of people said my childhood was normal, you know, until the 80s, and then it wasn't normal, right? And Romania is a particular case study. But for this, I chose actually a quote not from a child, but from, well, actually she was a child at a time, but I chose the quote of a woman who is referring to her mother. So she's remembering how her mother dealt with the fact that her father had been in prison. So her father was a philosopher who had been, this is Tudora. Actually, that's the next slide. You're not seeing it. I am. Sorry. So her father was a philosopher who had been imprisoned on political grounds for having studied in the West, and then he was later sent to the Black Sea Canal for forced labor. And because of his conviction, actually, she, at 12 years old, Tudora, was interrogated by the Securitate, and she came home really shaken, and she wasn't, you know, she didn't know what was going on, and of course, she had really negative thoughts then about her father. And then her mother had a conversation with her, and this is what, you know, she remembered about it. My mother was extraordinary. My mother raised us to be proud of the fact that our father was in jail because the greatest intellectuals in the country were there. She said, you need to be proud of the fact that your father was imprisoned. And so what I find particularly striking is that her mother obviously wanted her to take pride in her father, right? She wasn't with her, so she didn't have the time to spend with the father. And to reconfigure imprisonment as ennobling, something that's ennobling and that she should take pride in, and that would protect her, right? If anyone was defaming his character, right, at school or in the neighborhood, that she could know, no, he is with many other very highly respected intellectuals. And, you know, I think this was also kind of a coping skill, right? I mentioned the psychological significance of Eigensinn, right? And women in particular played a really important role in the early years of socialist rule in being the emotional support system for children, but also the economic, the financial one, because so many men were sent, disproportionately men were sent to prison, it was left to women to assume these roles, right? And, you know, her mother also, she talked about her mother always encouraged her to retain her faith in her countrymen and women. And, you know, I think it's just really significant in trying to teach resilience, pride in a system that would have, maybe in another circumstance, with another mother would have, you know, she would have, you know, not discussed this with her, she would have reinscribed it, and she would have maybe felt shame. So, and there were a number of instances where this was the case. Okay, then my third chapter looks at work, and here we have one of the images that was advertised for this presentation and another one. Now, of course, you know, work was one of the great promises of socialism, right? So alongside the peasantry and the exploited proletariat, it was going to be women that were going to be liberated by socialism, and that was going to be as a result of working in the labor force equally with men, right? And then, of course, that would ultimately transform marital relations, gender relations, and everyone would be happy. Here we see two images, right? We see a woman working in a kind of traditionally feminine sphere, textiles, and she's kind of beautified. And then you see two women who are working, you know, as engineers. They're at a construction site. And, you know, even though they might not be as, they might be a little rougher around the edges, it's still a bit of a sexualized image in a way, right? I mean, it's emphasizing something. But in any case, you know, one is from 78, one is from 65. But, you know, women were promoted, obviously, rapidly in labor force, although, you know, it was gradual depending on what field. Women did work in heavy industry to a degree. Actually, during the earlier part of socialist rule, they were working more, and then they were kind of moved into less arduous positions, and that was related directly to pronatalist policies. But I think also a part of it was concern about emasculating men. And so women, there were a lot of women in science because the idea was, well, if they worked in a lab, you know, it wasn't a threat to their reproductive organs, right? It wasn't physically arduous, but also there weren't too many men, and you weren't going to emasculate men, whereas if you're on, you know, a construction site, it might be different. But let's talk about some of the case studies, how women mobilized, expressed their eigensinn, their agency in the context of the labor force. Orodnjavanje was working as a quality control manager at a clothing factory, so she worked there in the 70s and the 80s. And she talked about this experience as kind of like being in jail. Not necessarily for her, but for the people who were partially under her direction, so the laborers. And she said, you know, you could say it was the work of animals. People didn't talk. Everyone was like a robot. People came to work Saturday afternoon, second shift, and left the next day, Sunday. They didn't produce much. They were not very efficient. I wouldn't work those Saturday night shifts. I didn't follow the herd. I told them it was inefficient for people to work at that time, that they were too tired. I gave them my opinion, but I didn't get in trouble because I was very good at my job. So, okay, she maybe was very good at her job. I think she was also probably lucky. Maybe she had some supervisors who, you know, tolerated that. I think in other cases that might not be the case. But what I find striking about this is that, you know, she was asserting the agency for herself, the eigensinn, the self-preservation. I'm not going to work on Saturday. I don't care if they make me, I'm not. But also trying to argue kind of collectively, right, for the rest of the laborers, some of the other laborers, that they shouldn't come in, that it's counterproductive, that it's inefficient, and that we shouldn't be doing this, that it doesn't make sense, right? And so you see here, and it's kind of one of the only cases I have where she's using it, eigensinn, mobilizing it for herself, but also in order to improve, ideally, the situation of others, which of course she doesn't. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about sexism and harassment, because of course, you know, it didn't magically go away, and especially for women who were in male-dominated fields. So I talked to a number of women construction workers and others, even in fields that were, you know, kind of gender equal, about expectations that women would be required of women for promotion, such as sexual favors and the like, or the fact that they wouldn't even be considered for promotion because the men would be considered first, right? Because the idea was that they were still the breadwinners and they were more skillful and talented at their jobs. So this was a recollection from Maria, who was an engineer and also a draftswoman and draftsperson. And she was reflecting on when she went to apply at this handicraft cooperative. And she was walking down the street and then she looked up. And this is what she said. When the foreman saw I was a woman, he came closer to the window. I told him not to jump out of the window. No need for that. That it was better for him not to meet with me. And then I heard he was not married. It was clear he felt an aversion towards women. He just never trusted a woman doing a man's job. Now, okay, this is kind of loaded in many ways, and we can get back to it. But what I think is interesting is that, you know, she was not going to tolerate it. She didn't even consider then even meeting with him because she could tell by the shocked look on his face that there's no way he was going to hire her. So why suffer the humiliation? And that she actually responded to him, right? Like she actually engaged with him and like said, you know, that, you know, don't jump out of the window, just because she was kind of thinking how absurd it was that he was so worried about hiring her. Because she felt, you know, if you look at when she was born in 1955, so she came of age, under socialism, access to, aware of legislation about the equality of the sexes, about the validation of women in the labor force. So for her, and she was, you know, in this field, and it was really interesting because she was interested in electronics and all that even when she was a girl. She had talked about that. So there was no question in her mind that she was going to go into, you know, engineering. But for her, it was just like, why wouldn't this be the case? So she made fun of him, and I think her making fun of him and asserting her right to fair treatment is really powerful. I think it was probably in the minority as well. Okay, another example from Maria, once she finally did get a job. So she did get a job, and she worked in a team of primarily men. Actually, she was the only woman. And here she was really trying to demonstrate her skill, her ability to work as well as men. And she struggled with it because, of course, and this is true all over the bloc, it was true in the Soviet Union, skill was gendered as male. It was considered this masculine preserve. So for women to exhibit skill, and I'm talking about skill in these male-dominated realms, not textiles, it was something completely out of the ordinary, and it really challenged gender norms, right, and gender expectations. But this is how she dealt with it and negotiated. And here's how she's reflecting on it. You know what it was like? It was a personality conflict. It was a continual battle working among men. First of all, it was very difficult to demonstrate to them what I knew, and that I knew it well, that nobody else needed to follow me, a man, for example, to correct the work once I had finished. After they got used to me, they treated me with dignity. They never talked badly to me. They never used vulgar words with me, because I would not tolerate it. Nor would I speak in a vulgar way with them. I had two choices, either to act like I didn't know anything or to be unusual. I preferred to be unusual, and I did very well. So I think what's interesting about this is she doesn't say it's a gender conflict. She says it's a personality conflict. But certainly there was a feminist awareness. There was an awareness that it was about her gender, just like in the previous passage. And of course, by now, you know, she went on, after she said this, she said, oh, well, I was so used to dealing with sexist men by this time, I asserted myself. But I knew I had to just assume this image of this oddball woman, right, this exceptional woman who was skilled at my trade. I wasn't going to play like the weak woman that needed to have the work done after me. But then she said, you know, they started respecting her when she embraced this identity of the oddball woman. And, you know, it's interesting, and all the tensions were diffused. You know, it seems that her male colleagues did not feel emasculated. They accepted her as an equal, right? They weren't following to check to see if her work was correct. And so a very clear example of how, you know, she asserted herself, right, and found this place for herself in a dignified way within this collective of male workers. But I think, again, this was exceptional, at least from the women I interviewed. Okay. So, one more thing. I'd mentioned this already, but, she, of course, was, familiar with the state discourse, which legislated equality between the sexes, which validated women in the workforce. So she could point to that. And she didn't note that she pointed to it, but I have a feeling that it informed how she presented herself. Okay, marriage. Love and marriage. Sometimes love, not always, right? So I have two images here, and these are from, and I'm sorry, I had a heading here, but it didn't go through for the one of the woman with the vacuum cleaner. But that's from, I believe, 1965. So I love the image, actually, of the man, of the worker, because he's assuming this kind of Superman role, right? We think of women in the double burden, but here it's the man who has the double burden. He's holding a briefcase, he's holding a baby, he's holding a duster, right? And the woman is behind him, kind of like assuming this bourgeois kind of secondary housewife type of role. But there was this column that talked about the new kind of husband. And under socialism, the new kind of husband was supposed to help out in the domestic sphere, right? Because that was a measure of his commitment to gender equality and his humanity. What was interesting also is he was expected to please women in the bedroom. And we can talk about that in the Q&A. But there was also discussion about how men just weren't sensitive to women's needs. Now, I think a lot of that was related to pronatalism, right? If you're pleasing your wife in the bedroom, well, she's going to want to have sex more often, and there's going to be more babies. And I should underscore that, obviously, because homosexuality was criminalized, marriage was presented as a heterosexist enterprise. But anyways, this is the ideal that was presented. So men were going to come help out in the home, and also vacuum cleaners were going to save women, right? They were going to be these labor-saving devices. Lenin had already promised that, and then they could read, right? They'd have time for leisure. But how did it actually play out on the ground? Well, the women, as I said, had access to these images. Many of them subscribed to Femea. Whether or not their husbands read it or not is another matter. In some of my interviews with men, I asked them about it. I said, were you familiar with this magazine? Did you read it? And he said, oh, well, I did the crossword puzzle. Oh, yeah, some of those images, yeah, they were okay. But it's kind of uncertain, to what degree they actually, the ideals and the messages, affected how men thought about gender relations. But in any case, here's a quote from, two quotes from two women about how they managed these relationships with their spouses. One is from Corina, born in 1960, and Corina says, the mentality was no different. The women at the frying pan. The woman at the frying pan, the man as the leader, but I didn't accept it. I didn't want to accept it. I said, in the first place, we are both people. We both work. We both bring in money. We will do everything together. So self-assertion, because of course she understood notions of gender equality, but also self-preservation. I mean, we have to think about these relationships in the terms with respect to the double burden, and some even refer to it as a triple burden, that women had to preserve their strength, that if women wanted to get any sleep, essentially, they needed to have assistance, and not just from their mothers, right, or from their daughters, but from their spouses as well, from their partners. And indeed, the magazine, Femea, that I mentioned, had articles about how mothers should be raising their boys and girls, right, their sons and daughters, to both do housework, to both have responsibility, so that women no longer have to suffer this double burden. So she did this in a very kind of explicit, assertive way. Angela did it kind of more in a persuasive way, right? So, and this is, I think it's another example of Eigensinn, but it kind of in a way reinforces a patriarchal structure, but but it challenges it at the same time, and we can talk about it. But she said, in general, you need to know how to deal with men here in Romania, to leave them to do things when they want. If you push him, hey, look now, I want you to do this work, and he sees that he's being pushed, or if I say something in a certain tone, a tone of superiority because I want something resolved immediately, well, it might not be resolved. But if I leave him alone, speak nicely to him, or say that he can do it when he wants, then he does it. Again, kind of in a way, maybe partially walking on eggshells, but if we get back to one of the definitions of Eigensinn, which is self-preservation as well, right? Carving out a space for yourself, right? So that you can have maybe an extra hour of sleep or some leisure. It makes sense, right? And so for her, this was the most effective way to mobilize it and to negotiate these relationships. This one I really like. Elena, who was also born in 1960. She's talking about not her spouse, but her partner, so her boyfriend at the time. And it's loaded in many ways, so I'll talk about it after I read it. But she reflected, he expected me to treat him as his mother did, but I did not do that. And his mother told me that that was my duty, to wash his trousers, to cook for him, to clean for him. And I said, okay, is he disabled? I can help him if he's disabled. If not, he should do these things himself. And from that moment on, I totally refused to do these things for him. And little by little, he was able to wash dishes, to cook eggs for himself, to wash his trousers, and to keep himself clean, to keep things clean. So here, she's kind of just making a mockery out of it. Really? Are you so helpless? Like, are you disabled that you can't do this? And I think also what's striking here is you have this pressure of the older generation of women who sometimes wanted to sustain and maintain these cultural practices, right, that I mentioned earlier. And so they are challenging, right? They're challenging socialist discourse that's trying to promote greater equality in the domestic sphere. And so women are having to deal with this as well, not only the demands that the men might make, but also the men's mothers. And this came up in a number of areas in the magazine, but also in my interviews with these women. Okay, divorce as liberation. And this is quite a rich reflection as well. Valeria, born in 1937, she was obviously one of the oldest individuals I interviewed. And she's reflecting on her marriage with a man who's older than her. And they had dated, and she had talked about, you know, how when they were dating, it was just like they were colleagues, right? It was fine. So she said, when I married, there was a difference of 12 years. I was 20, he was 32. I had just come from adolescence. I went into marriage straight from boarding school, not knowing how to defend my interests. When I realized that a woman could defend herself, and when I realized the slogans that were used, equality between women and men, I began to earn my rights, freedom of thought, of behavior, to rest, to take part in raising my child, not to be an obedient slave. I would not take it. Especially when I saw the movie Spartacus. I decided to leave because I realized I was not put on this earth to be a slave. After the divorce, I decided to go to college. I wanted to change my life. I thought if I finish university, I will have more power to change my life, to change my job, and also to change my destiny. So some of the things I mentioned, you know, referencing communist slogans and coming to this realization after the practical experience of marriage, right? And I think the age difference was a part of it too. And she talked about how he was educated traditionally, and that was a term that was used. So brought up kind of in a traditional way. But also how Western film that had made it to its way to Romania by this time affected her interpretation, right? She saw Spartacus, Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus, and she said, nope, I'm not going to take it. I'm not going to be a slave. So I think it's a really interesting way of, you know, using popular culture and then applying it to your situation and interpreting it and it giving you the motivation, right, to finally challenge that situation. Okay, so my fifth chapter is on reproductive policies and parenthood. And here I've got an image that's promoting fertility, obviously, promoting prenatalism with a pregnant woman. And then I've got this lovely image of the Ceausescus. And I put that up there just because of the way in which they're depicted in this painting. And I think it, you know, you'll see in the next two quotes that I reference, which are my last two, why people are referring to them this way in their letters. So I'm going to switch from the oral histories to Radio Free Europe letters. So letters that were sent to Radio Free Europe, because that's one of the other sources that I draw on. And this was a letter that a group of women workers wrote, that's how they signed the letter, to Radio Free Europe. Obviously, it was anonymous. It still was somewhat dangerous to send these letters. But they are writing this letter in response to the obligatory gynecological exams that were mandated in Romania as a part of Ceausescu's pronatalist policies. So the idea that factory workers in particular, it was mainly factory workers, were going to be monitored. Their pregnancy, their cycle was going to be monitored, and their pregnancy was going to be monitored. And if they were pregnant, that was jotted down by the doctor who examined them at the workplace, and then it was followed. And that was a way to ensure they brought the pregnancy to term. And we can, in the Q&A, also talk about the way in which women skirted around it. And indeed, I think, you know, pronatalism is a very rich topic for looking at ways in which women resisted and maybe mobilize their Eigensinn, but it's kind of harder. I mean, I wouldn't say having an abortion is a form of Eigensinn necessarily, but I would say a letter like this is more so, and so that's why I wanted to include this. And so they're writing to Elena Ceausescu in response. And they say, whose idea was it that young women should be subject to a periodic exam to determine if we are pregnant and to be registered like cattle, to see, after 9 months, how many children we will bring into the world for the most beloved son of the people. And that gets back to the image I showed you in the last slide, right? I don't want to believe that if, when you were young, if someone would have come to you with such an idea, you would not have protested. If you don't rescind these obligations, we will appeal to all the young women in the world and ask them to protest against this inhumane and humiliating policy. So, you know, they're obviously poking fun at Ceausescu. They're saying to Elena Ceausescu, well, you didn't have to deal with this. And of course, that's because when she was of childbearing age, abortion was legal, at least during part of it. And, you know, I think they're more emboldened because it's an anonymous letter, right? It's being published outside of Romania. And they feel safer doing this, right? But I think it's still a strong evidence of self-assertion against the state policies, right? And in response to what the state authorities and to a state authority. So, you know, it's not the private sphere, it's not the workforce. They're taking on the state here. Okay, one more example about family and reproduction. And this is not abortion. This is about having an illegitimate child, which actually illegitimacy did not exist in Romania. But Ildiko, who was born in 1963 in a town near Brașov, a smaller town, reflected on how some of the people in the town viewed her after she had a child out of wedlock. She said, they looked down on me, not my neighbors, but in general, like people from the country do. It was a small town, and in small towns, everyone knows what everyone else is doing. And they talk behind your back, and that one has a small child. But it didn't bother me, because I wanted a child. And, you know, I think part of the reason, I mean, obviously she loved her child, but part of the reason is there was no distinction any longer between illegitimate and legitimate children, right? There was that they didn't exist, that all children had access to benefits, right? They were acknowledged. Of course, this was related to the pronatalist policy, but also this is true of other socialist countries, right? There was no distinction. Of course, she was familiar with these policies. And I think what's significant is that she's, you know, as I said, in some cases they're not challenging the state, they're challenging cultural practices, traditional cultural practices or beliefs or attitudes, and that's what she's doing. So just like in other circumstances where women were challenging patriarchal practices, here she's challenging, you know, cultural ones, prevailing cultural ones. Okay, and my last, well, I have one more with respect to parenthood, and then I have one more slide, and hopefully you have enough time. So this is, these two quotes are from the same person, Stella, and she was talking about how she was able to deal with the double burden because, as I said, Romania had one of the shortest maternity leaves. It's 3 months long. And the issue was, you know, how do you continue breastfeeding? Obviously, we're talking about a country with no breast pumps. How do you continue caring for your child? Do you actually want to leave a child who's 3 months old or 4 months old at a creche, right? With a nanny, with your mother, with hired help. And so here she's talking about how she was able to negotiate this and manage this situation. And, you know, I think it's clear, too, that in some cases, Eigensen is obviously a form of managing. So she says, there was a way to circumvent returning to work. You would go to the doctor, the dispensary, and you would invent some type of children's illness, and you could extend it, maternity leave. And a number of the women I interviewed did this. They would go to the doctors, and they would say, I want an extension of my maternity leave. He's sick. I need to stay with him, or she's sick. And they would do it. And of course, they could mobilize this effectively because we're talking about a society, a government that is glorifying motherhood, right? So how could the state rightfully then argue, no, you have to get back to the work, right? And so because motherhood had such strong cultural salience, traditionally it had a lot of salience, but also because it was integral, right, to state policy at the time, women were effectively able to do this. Then when she finally did go to work, she talked about how she was able to, you know, look after her child and also work, right? And another example of kind of flouting, right? You know, so because of course Eigensen is also, you know, it involves in some cases flouting. So not like the type of resistance on this very overt public level, but flouting. And she says, there is a term in Romanian, to play hooky. Well, we needed to be at work from 7 to 3, and I was on the go for a lot of work. I had to go from place to place, read telephone meters to interpret data, and in between two centers, I would rush home and look after the children. I don't know, probably not many people were able to do this, do that. And probably they weren't. I mean, if you were obviously a teacher, you couldn't leave, you know, that. But if you worked maybe at an institute, some cases actually people brought their children to institutes, or you could just leave early. But this was another example of kind of how they managed, right? And how they were able to, you know, find a way to carve out a space to negotiate the challenges that arose of not being able to find childcare or not feeling comfortable leaving one's child in a creche or a kindergarten because they were so prone to illness because they were overcrowded. Okay, and so this is my final case study, and this is based on chapter 6, which deals with consumption. And I have an image of two women from the late 60s. This is from the women's magazine Moda, which means fashion. And they're enjoying a brandy in their nice mini dresses, juxtaposed against what Romania looks like in the 1980s, right? The queuing in winter, and here they're in front of a butcher shop. And my last case study is another letter to Elena Ceausescu from a group of women to Radio Free Europe in 1984. And I think this really encapsulates so many of the challenges that women faced, the contradictions between everyday life and socialist policy, all the complexities. And I'll just read this. You don't seem to want to understand that we've had enough of so many lies and that we wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning to wait in line, and after that go to work. And when we leave work, we try out another line just to get a little something, to continuously not have hot water, to not have heating in our apartments in winter, at work, to have electricity cut off in our apartments, not to be able to refill our gas canister when it's empty, to see only preserves and drinks in the stores, to procure our ration food, especially sugar, at outrageous prices, to be required to work when ill, if we don't have a fever above 40, et cetera, in order to personally convince us of the optimal conditions for the protection of mothers and children, and how impressively the healthcare system has grown across the country. You make a few unannounced visits to hospitals, creches, and you see unannounced is in quotes, right? Unfortunately, you are not at all interested in what Romanian women endure. And we ask you, why? If you had been born into a palace, we would understand. Have you actually forgotten where you came from and what you fought for in your youth? If it's true that you are the dearest mother, you should understand all Romanian children, not only your own. We also believe that our children have the right to a civilized life. So again, illustrating this disconnect between policy and everyday life, but also really criticizing quite ardently Elena Ceausescu, saying, you come from modest roots. How dare you impose these restrictions on us? You're not a member of the aristocracy, but yet you're acting like you are. And You know, the whole idea of the dearest mother, right? So back to the painting I showed you earlier, the way in which the Ceausescus were glorified in this very kind of paternal, or parental way. Of course, again, this was anonymous, so they felt more emboldened to express this opinion. But I should say that as the 80s wore on, there were more and more letters to the authorities in Romania, to the Communist Party, so not to Radio Free Europe, that started pointing out these contradictions and really criticizing the regime. And as we know, the Ceausescus didn't listen to it, because had they, we wouldn't have had that. And that's where I'm going to end.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this. Really, it's a great patchwork, if I can call it. You know, a lot of oral history with examples and voices of those women you've interviewed, with the pictures, and it brings a lot of it sounds familiar in some cases with our own experience here in former Yugoslavia, with this big difference that the late 1960s in Romania brought this retraditionalization, I don't know how to call it, with pro-natalist policies and criminalization of homosexuality and so on, whilst in Yugoslavia and other European countries, basically, we had the opposite trend. And so we could maybe discuss even that bigger context in the lives of women in Romania regarding that shift from a relatively prosperous socialist country of the 1960s and 1970s with this new paradigm that occurred at that time. But maybe something on that matter can also be brought to light by Anamarija, who has some experience with Romania, I think. So please, take a seat here, in between, in between me and Jill, and please take another mic, I think, so if we have that much of them, I think we should use them all.
It's working, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, Jill, a lot for the presentation, and thank you for the book. I will have a longer comment and a short question. I think I will start with a comment, and I hope I can squeeze it all in 10 minutes. So, in the beginning, when I started reading the book, I had very mixed feelings. I felt apprehensive and curious and sad and happy and uncomfortable in the same time. Why? Because I could not really position myself as a reader. And I kept asking myself, am I reading it as an anthropologist, or am I reading it as somebody who has experienced on her own skin the last years of Romanian communist regime? How should I read it? In the end, what am I supposed to talk about, or what are my comments supposed to be if I cannot even decide what this book is for me? That's why I will use this paper, because there are a lot of things I would like to say, and probably I will forget something. First, what I want to say is that Jill writes from the position of an outsider. Lucky her. I am sort of a double insider, and by talking here today and sharing with you my thoughts, I think I could also sort of come to terms with my memories of that period. So going back to the book, when I started reading it and reading the testimonies, part of which you also had the chance to read now, I felt like a blow from the past, because I was born in the late 70s, and I grew up in socialist Romania of the 80s, meaning during the gloomiest years of the Romanian communist regime, in a small industrial town in Transylvania. I think I could relate most to the second chapter, Children of the Revolution, gender and the abnormality of growing up socialist. When the Romanian Revolution of December 1989 broke up, I was 11 years old. Only when opening the book I noticed a strange resemblance. I was then the age of my older daughter. The Romanian Revolution was for me the day the world stopped, the world as I knew it. And then, you know, when I saw that you chose the titles of chapters according to these songs, I also thought of a song that's the end of the world as we know it. I think it's an REM song. And I mean, I only thought about it last night and I thought, so that was the world, the day the world as I knew it stopped. And after that, something completely different began, but I will not talk about that. Without comparing the two events, I can say that when the pandemic hit last year, my daughter was also turning 11. The world also changed significantly for her, right? With the lockdown and social contacts reduced to a minimum, having to wear a mask all the time, not being able to visit her relatives in Romania. And least but not last, spending lots of time with her mom. Because I was in home office for almost the entire year, and my daughter and her younger sister were in homeschooling. So we did everything together and talked about everything, including my childhood. As you can imagine, they were very curious. Oh, so you didn't have McDonald's, you didn't have smartphones, you didn't have cartoons on TV. No, you only had 2 hours of propaganda programs, sometimes not even hot water or electricity. And as you can imagine, my younger daughter, who was 7, was shocked. And she kept on asking, what about this, what about that? And in the end, her conclusion was, Mom, you were like cave people. Were you hunting for food? Well, we were not hunting for food, to her big relief, but in the late 70s and in the 80s, there was nothing in the stores in Romania, in the grocery stores. Ceausescu wanted to pay off the foreign debt, and the result was a huge shortage of consumer goods. Unlike here in Yugoslavia, where socialism had a human face up to a point. So the population was desperate and relied on the black market, connections, and barter as basic survival strategies. Shortage presented particular challenges for women, as you showed, because women were the ones who struggled to put something on the table and really to invent meals. Without the basic ingredients, without electricity, without hot water. I really don't know how they did it. Why am I saying all this? Because Jill talked about gendering, Eigensen, and the role of women. Well, in those gloomy times, but I only realized it last year when talking about it to my daughters, women and our moms were the heroes. Just imagine entering a grocery store and finding nothing on the shelves. You could buy oil and sugar once a month. Meat was also rationalized. You could only buy, I think, if I remember correctly, half a bread per member of family per day. There was no coffee, there were no sweets. And still our moms managed to do it. They always found a way. They bartered flour for sugar, oil for, I don't know, eggs. They were all engaged in these informal and illicit systems. And they came up with the most creative and inventing recipes to make up for the missing ingredients. And we almost all the time had edible food, if not delicious food, on the table, and cakes, and even ice cream. Then my daughters did not even know that you can make ice cream and not buy it. So she asked again, but how? What did they make it out of? Out of thin air? And I said, well, yes, apparently out of thin air. And to quote again my younger daughter, she asked something very sweet, I think. Where did your mom keep her wand? And indeed, I think this is a very fitting comparison. Our moms made magic happen in those very gloomy times. That's why, and now I come to my point, I have very fond memories of my childhood, which paradoxically, objectively speaking, unfolded during the darkest years of Romanian communism. And I think Jill's merit is to have come up with this great word, ambiguity, and with this approach according to which there is no simple, coherent narrative of life under socialism, but rather multiple and at times contradictory narratives. Such an approach, I think, produces not only a more complex portrait of state socialism and everyday life, but is indeed a historical necessity, weaving women's varied experiences into the broader political and social fabric of Romania. It challenges conventional representations of an all-powerful socialist state ruling over a miserable and desperate population. And now, finally, what I want to say is that, like Jill, I do not regard the foremost Romanian communist government as legitimate. Far from that. However, I do regard the memories of my childhood and those of other people who lived and worked and cooked lunch out of thin air during that period as perfectly legitimate. And now, after this long and maybe too personal comment, I would like to ask Jill a question. Because Srđan mentioned my collection of interviews with people from Timișoara, meaning from the western border of Romania. It started as a linguistic research because I knew people there regularly watched the programs of the Yugoslav TV and they learned Serbian, and I wanted to see, after 20 years, after the exposure to these Serbian language programs, how much they could still speak it. However, their stories were much more interesting than the real tests, language tests. And then I switched the focus of my research, and that's how the book came about. So my question was, because you say in the book, I mean, you base your analysis mainly on testimonies of people from Brașov and Bucharest. Do you think the book would have been different had you taken into account the stories of these people from the western border who had a slightly different image of Romanian communism because they were so close to the West and they had this opening, they could look at the free world over the border, and they came accustomed to American cultural products and to consumerism, and they even had access to more consumer goods in that period. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for your comments and your question. So I'll just answer that question. So I did read, so Smaranda Vultur has written about, those experiences in Timișoara, since she's, an anthropologist who does these interviews. And so I reference one in my consumption chapter about access to goods, and then some other scholars have looked at cross-border trading, and that really helped me in the consumption chapter understand how yes, if you were in the western part of the country, you were in a way privileged if you could cross the border, and you had the guards, like the guards that you encountered were bribable, right? Because some would just confiscate everything. Yeah, I think if I included more Western experiences, yeah, I think we'd get a little bit more. But I feel like there was quite a rich life in Bucharest as well, with the Cinemateca, and there were these foreign films. I talk about that in chapter 6, where they were watching these foreign films, and then there were also the videothèques where they would show the films, and of course they were dubbed, you know, by that Romanian Nistor, yeah. But there was some access, and of course class mattered, right? So if you had a parent or a family member who was traveling abroad, they could bring the VCR, they could bring the videos. So I think location mattered, but I think also kind of where you worked. So sometimes it could be where you work, but also your position and the hierarchy made a difference. And, you know, I did interview one woman whose husband was involved in export, and so she said, we never suffered in the 80s, you know, we never had a rough time, we had more than enough food. And so, and she was just like, it was fine, and she didn't really self-reflect. She didn't really acknowledge how horrible it was for others, and I found that really striking, you know. But yeah, that might be a long way of answering that question. But then we could ask the question, would it be different too if they were, you know, up in, I don't know, the northeastern part of the country, right? So, yeah.
Thank you both, and I would just like to shortly add what Anamarija was also commenting, how there is a lot of these accounts by women in Jill's book that sometimes even sound contradictory. At the same time, they espouse happiness of as you said yourself. It was objectively the worst part of modern Romanian history after 45, the 80s, yet your childhood memories are beautiful because you were a child. And I remember when I was a young, fresh sophomore anthropologist and I finished my master's thesis, I was very frustrated by the fact that my informants on the issue, which I was researching at the time, gave very contradictory notions and thinkings about the topic. To cut the story short, I was doing how they perceive Europe, they hated and loved it at the same time in the same sentence. And when I talked to a member of my commission, and she said, first thing you need to remember, there is no cohesion in people's minds and narratives, especially when thinking about A, past, B, abstract things and ideas and so on. So being contradictory is maybe one of the essences of being human at the same time.
I think that's one of the beauties of doing history. I mean, I tell my students that if history is not messy, then we're missing part of the story. And if there aren't some contradictions, right? If it's a really kind of linear narrative that's easy to understand, there might be something missing. And I think, yeah, that's like, this is why I love it so much, because you can even see those contradictions within one interviewee, right? And to just really briefly, you know, you read the chapter, you were referring to the chapter on childhood. So one of the persons I interviewed was a friend of mine, an artist, and she talked about how wonderful her childhood was as well. And then she became, you know, an adolescent, and then she went to art school. She went to art school in the late 80s, and she talked about how her paintbrushes were frozen. You know, she couldn't even do anything because everything was frozen, and she was so cold. And then how they started destroying parts of Bucharest, and it was like a part of her soul was taken. And so, yeah, as a child, everything was fine. But then she really, once she was starting to come of age, she noticed the difference once they were becoming, you know, teens. And one more thing, I think your comment about mothers is spot on, and especially mothers, but parents in general and grandparents, they really wanted to, I don't want to say insulate totally, but they wanted to make life as meaningful and as happy for children as they could under the circumstances. And I think that's only natural, right? Parents want to do that. And that's why I couldn't, you know, just say the abnormality, because a lot of it, everyone's said, you know, I had a normal childhood. My childhood was normal. Almost everyone, so.
Yeah, and thank you for additional comments, both of you. And for the cherry on the top of this beautiful evening, I would like to invite Adriana Zaharijević. Excuse me? You have 5-10 minutes, and being a philosopher, I think you'll manage it. Yeah, I guess. Adriana, please.
I'm just joking. I'm referring to what you said about the anthropology and how everything needs to be somehow messy, and the philosopher in me simply is in an upsurge against such a thinking. Thank you, Jill. I mean, it was really important and interesting, but I want to say that the book is even more important and even more interesting. And I would like to reflect just shortly on another very important notion for me. I mean, one of the most important notions ever, I think. Anamarija was stressing the notion of ambiguity, and I would like to stress the notion of agency. Because I'm not only an outsider, unlike Anamarija in this story, and as I said to Jill yesterday, not only that I'm an outsider, but I'm the neighbor who has very, very scarce knowledge about the neighbors. But I'm also someone who is a non-historian, so in that sense I was really looking for, apart from this book being very interesting and informative in many ways, what I really got from it is a kind of embeddedness and contextualization of the notion of agency, which is this ever-present and very important notion. And for people who do the translations, and probably there are people like this here as well, if we try to translate that very important notion into our local languages, there are troubles, and there is no regular or expected reference to that one. So even on that level, it's complicated. And also on the other level, which you very much also somehow show in the trajectories of the text that you used, in the sense of many discussions where this book is part of now a long discussion about was there any agency behind the Iron Curtain world, the discussion that began already in the Cold War era when the world was bipolar, so also the way of thinking about things was in a sense bipolar. That was somehow solidified, I would say, during the 90s, and then around the great economic crisis, the things started to change a little bit. And it seems to me that this book really contributes greatly to this discussion about how agentic and in what sense can one be agentic, how do we understand agency after all. So I wanted to just follow up on what I said from the introduction, which then later on really testifies, these words are really testified by the book itself, where what we see here is the examination of the oppressive alongside the emancipatory, the monotonous alongside the joyous, the ordinary alongside the extraordinary. Somehow I think this alongside being put forward is something which this book really is important for. And then also, and that is something which is, when we also think about Yugoslavia, and especially with Cejus here, that is something which is attempted to be grasped, this another thing, how state socialism both constrained and enabled agency. This is something, especially for me in the context of feminism, which is important, how it was possible that there was feminism in Yugoslavia and how it was enabled, but at the same time constrained, and these kind of thoughts. So as this book, as we have seen, showcases a kind of, and rests upon the assumption on the interrelationship between gender, politics, everyday life, and what I find very important, social citizenship, as I said to Jill yesterday, which is somehow under theorized notion in the context of post-socialist studies, especially, again, I'm referring to the ones that I know best, post-Yugoslav, because it is in those interrelationships that the human agency can be captured. And this is, as I said, again, something which this book really does beautifully. We consulted a friend and a translator who lives in Germany, Hanna Ćopić, and who told us that Eigensinn should be translated as svojeglavosť, as Srđan at the beginning mentioned, that means really to be of your own head and with your own head, and somehow also with that head do something around I don't know, the heads that feel something in your head and maybe redirect that stream. And in that sense, I mean, and this presentation told us a lot about these quotations, told us a lot about, I will just quote a little, how individuals flaunted or resisted state policies, which were in fact shaping not only our lives and their lives in Romania, but the way they thought of themselves, the way they thought they should think of themselves and act, how they worked, quote unquote, the system, enjoyed state services, or just muddled through. And I very much like this muddling through, because I think that is where anthropologists are very much needed for us with our straight and straightforward thinking. So to give the mud. Exactly, to provide the mud, of course. What I also find very important in this discussion on agency, which is then bigger than a historian, history debate, or a socialist, post-socialist debate, is that finally, I mean, we are constantly in some kind of negotiation of what agency really is, in the sense of, is there one valid, legitimate, universalist notion of what one is supposed to be doing? Who is that one who does that? And I think that this book really shows us that there are very interesting ways how to approach that question. So I think that we are out of time. I had many things. I mean, I wanted, in fact, to give space to Džil to tell us more about chapters, which are really all very interesting. Then I decided to stick with two little questions. Do I have the time? Because this was this kind of celebratory part of the...
We have 5 to 10 minutes more, so shoot.
Okay, so the first one, the first question is, in a way, I want to think in an alternative way, because I want to also struggle against the teen ideology, that there is no alternative. So after reading your book, especially this chapter on socialism, socialism take on marriage, on love and marriage, I started to think again of the one question that is tormenting me. Can socialism transform marriage and even more love? I know it's a question, about the futurologists and not about historians. But I think, I'm having a reference to that. I mean, that question somehow appeared from this, that as you say, early socialist thinkers' vision of marriage as a union of equal comrades, joined by mutual interest, affection, and goals, remained for some women, or many women, and not only in socialism, just that, a vision. Yeah? And also, since marriage, love, and family are of course very, very often, or most often, interconnected, then the question is really, what happened? Where did they get the things wrong somehow? There was some chance for that transformation to take place, but it didn't. In Romania, even more so, because what they did have in 1966 was already almost a complete trampling on the previous idea of those notions of the visionary thinkers. So that would be my first incentive for you to talk more rather than a question. And the other one also, now I don't need this paper anymore, because we had these two wonderful quotes from the group of women in Radio Free Europe. How come that with the situation that like it was, and also with this very, the quotes that you decided to show to us show that these women really, svojeglave, they really had their own heads on their own shoulders, so to say, eigensinnig. But how come that there was no feminism? how come that feminism did not appear? Because these women, for me, this is a feminist statement, as well as the previous one. I mean, where are the feminists? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the great questions. Okay, so, I mean, we've never had any real socialism, so, you know, we can't know whether or not there'll be equality with the sexes because socialism's never been done right? It's still men at the top, right? And so you still have patriarchal structures that are centrally a part of all socialist states that have been, you know, that are, okay, socialist states, so-called socialist states, right? Because we know they're state socialist at best. I mean, that's the eternal question, like, how do we get a group that is used to having power, convince them to share that power? So it's like, it's a question, I think, almost more about patriarchy than anything, right? I don't have an answer to it. I mean, yeah, certainly like things improved in many respects, and women were emboldened to leave their marriages. Had there not been socialism and the type of legislation associated with the divorce at the time, you know, they would have been stuck in these marriages. So certainly there were improvements, but I mean, I think it's like we need to find how we can get rid of patriarchy before we, like, you know, draw on an existing system. And, you know, one of the things I note in my book is that, like, you know, yeah, you have men in charge who are schooled by, you know, very influenced by traditional values, and they're supposedly espousing socialist values, but really, I mean, these are mentalities. It's the, how do you change mentalities? You can just implement the policy, you can, you know, you can produce the magazines, but mentalities are so slow. And also when you have other women, you know, who are also resistant to abolishing patriarchy. How do you do it? Because for some reason, they're invested in patriarchy. Now, I don't want to say they have a false sense of the world, because I don't want to impose my interpretation on them, but, you know, it seems like if there's one thing I could wish for in the world, it would be the abolition of, well, patriarchy, also racism, all those things. Okay, I mean, I could go on, but really, I mean, I think so much stems from patriarchy, but I mean, it's all interlinked and it's overlapping. Your next question, why did women feel emboldened to do this? Because they were desperate, because life was getting more and more miserable, and they couldn't, I mean, they couldn't feed their families properly. There was nothing in the stores. They couldn't cook. The cooking gas was being turned off. The heat was being turned off. They could not, as mothers, as caregivers, you know, they could not execute what they needed to in those conditions. It was impossible. And I didn't include the quote because it wasn't about Eigensen, but one of the women was talking about how when she had a baby and she had to boil water, to give him a bath, she had to boil water on the stove in a pot, and it would take like 2 hours. And then she had to do it by candlelight. And she had to carry the buggy up 5 flights of stairs because the elevator wasn't working. And she was like, it was miserable. But then she's like, at the same time, he was so sweet and cute, and I loved him so much. Like, can you imagine, you know? Or the other woman who just said she was going from place to place, from pharmacy to find powdered milk because her milk had run out. And just the psychological, how psychologically taxing those experiences are. I mean, thank goodness, I can't imagine experiencing anything like this, but that's where that's coming from. The desperation, because they want to care for their children and their families, and they can't. And why is there not a feminism? Because, I mean, I think there was. I think there was feminist consciousness. I think the quotes I illustrate make it clear that there was, right? But that, you know, obviously grassroots organizing was illegal, right? Where you couldn't have an anti-state body or a body that existed outside of the state. But, I mean, so I put this slide up because, you know, once socialism collapses, then you see these feminist mobilization, right? And this is a slide from, you know, 2 years ago, 2019. But I wanted to, you know, just put it up because it highlights that feminist mobilization is still quite strong in Romania. And you can see that, so you can see it says sexism kills. That's what that says there, that sign there. Together for the health or for the safety of women. And then if one falls, we all fall. And so these were protests that occurred in July of 2019. And this was right around the time that, I don't know how much time I have, but a girl was, do you remember what city it was in? You know which incident I'm talking about, where she was walking home and she couldn't take the bus, and then the bus wasn't running, and so she hitchhiked, and she was picked up by this man who took her to his house and ended up killing her. Yeah, so a lot of that organizing was happening around this time. And also there was anti-state protests in that summer as well. So there was a lot going on in 2019. But I mean, these issues about safety are there. There's always, concerns about domestic violence. It took forever to get a restraining order implemented in Romania. But just a horrific thing. And it went back, of course, to this issue of like, all these institutions are corrupt. And corruption kills, but it's especially is dangerous for women, right? And I could go talk forever, so I'm not going to do that now. But that's what this is in relation to. And I wanted to have kind of end on, I guess, the note of empowerment, that women still feel empowered, that and men join them in the protests, and that there are these efforts, to challenge patriarchy, challenge corruption.
Thank you, Jill, very much. Thank you, Adriana and Anamarija as well. We have very, very little time left. So is there any questions, comments, or anything you would like to add to our presenters tonight? And if not, which seems to be the case, which is good because we're over time, I would like to really sincerely thank, first of all, Jill, who really gave this wonderful overview of her research in this wonderful form and reminded us how, although us in former Yugoslavia always think that our socialism was indeed different from other socialism of the bloc, there were similarities we could catch up on, especially from the period before the late 60s and 70s in terms of ideological, cultural, and the rise of Romanian nationalism period, and especially compared to the 1980s. But there is this modernist, also gender experience of this period of modernity in entire Europe that somehow until late 60s, early 70s was shared by most of Europe, not only socialist Europe, but also Western Europe, everything. And what also Adriana what has commented, that she did not know much about Romanian feminism, or maybe Romania's experiences of the era that much, that we also need to learn that, not only in terms of gender in socialism in other countries, but also about everyday life and paradigms of living and thinking in other former socialist countries and their experiences, which we somehow, in what used to be former Yugoslavia, reluctantly isolated in our minds as being superior Yugoslavs in between the East and the West, and with our non-white position. Thank you, Jill, very much. Thank you, Adriana. Thank you, Anamarija. And thank you all for coming tonight.